I'm a public representative for Lasair and Derry, and I will be chairing tonight's event. Lasair is a young movement formed from a collective of community and political activists in recent years. It is avidly socialist Republican, and we uphold the ideals of Connolly, Kearney, Melrose, and many others. Organising tonight's event and gathering was not an easy task, as the forces of capital and surprisingly some individuals within the paid community sector proactively attempted to prevent this meeting from taking place. Facebook has deliberately restricted our social media pages, and individuals who are fully funded to work within the interest of our community try to block us from using local community spaces. The development of a viable and credible socialist Republican alternative should only be welcomed, and our efforts will not be distracted by people who are self-proclaimed community gatekeepers. This is not reflective of the wider community sentiment of the city, and I would like to extend this sincere thanks to those community activists, workers and groups who not only support this event tonight, but have been very proactive in making it a reality. Tonight's discussion is based on drugs, addiction and decriminalisation, and aligns with the recently launched Lasair policy document of the same name. We have a very good lineup tonight, and I would like to introduce our panel. Frankie Healy is a community worker and drug safety activist in his native Derry. Nicola is a Lasair activist from Belfast and has been a driving force in the development of Lasair's drug addiction, decriminalisation and policy document. Donnelly is a local independent councillor, community activist and Republican. Each speaker will be given 10 minutes to speak with a maximum of 15 minutes, and this will be followed by 20 minutes of Q&A. Each table has a pen and paper there, so you can write down throughout the debate any questions you have. We will get these at the end of the event. And without further ado, I would like to welcome and introduce our first speaker on this panel, Frankie Healy. Frank.
Thanks very much, Gabhann, and welcome everyone. As Gabhann was saying, I'm Frankie Healy. I'm a student at Queen's in Belfast. I'm also a community worker and a drug safety activist. But I'll get a bit more into what that means in a second. I'd like to say a big thanks for throwing the event as well. Lasair, I think it has a lot of potential. We've gotten a decent turnout here tonight as well, so it's great to see people showing up to support the topic. I'd like to praise them also for taking a stance on this topic. As a drug safety campaigner, one of the main things that I've noticed is people just aren't really addressing the issue or the topic, whatever way you want to put it. The main problem, I think, is that people aren't talking about this. They're not talking about drugs, the topic that affects us all to some extent, whether it's personal, in your family life, your friends. We've all been impacted by this, and we have the possibility to make a big change in how things are run. Because drug abuse and misuse could easily spiral out of control if we don't make an effort to curtail the problem. Tell you a bit about my background, my story, just cover the basics first. So whenever I was younger, didn't really like alcohol or smoking. I'd sort of, I suppose, seen adults whenever I was a kid just drinking a lot, and it put me off to an extent. Whenever I found out there was a third option, whenever I was 14, didn't even really know what I was getting into, to be honest, but I just started to experiment with things and went down a particular path. Today, I'm 22. I started smoking grass whenever I was, or weed, whatever way you want to put it, whenever I was 14, as I was saying. From 16, went on to take harder substances. I've ended up hospitalised multiple times to do with drugs, particularly to do with taking substances that were contaminated or not what I thought they were in the first place, which is one of the biggest parts to this problem. But I also, at the time, had some very enjoyable experiences whenever I'd taken substances, so it didn't fully put me off, but I realised that there is a right way and a wrong way to do things like drugs, even things like driving, for example. Like, it can be very dangerous, or you can do it in a safe way, or things, I don't know, the list goes on. But it's strange in English how we have this one word for drugs and it sort of has multiple connotations to it. If you've read Michael Pollan's book, This Is Your Mind on Plants, he points out that in ancient Greek there was a word for drugs that was pharmakon. Now that had a bit of ambiguity to it. That meant both a medicine and a poison, a blessing and a curse, and basically came down to the dosage that you're taking and the way you're taking it. It could be a very good thing, it could be a very bad thing. Ironically, it also meant a scapegoat, which I think to an extent drugs are being used as today in certain instances. I would still take substances to an extent today. If I do that, I would do it in a safe way, which I'm going to demonstrate for you. Now, there's no actual drugs on the table here. What I've brought in with me is aspirin, but we'll get into that in a moment. I would say one of the biggest parts to this dilemma is ignorance. It's, like I was saying, not being talked about. People aren't educating themselves on the topic and they're just doing it sort of willy-nilly and end up getting hurt. There is a safe way to do things regarding testing kits, dosage, setting, a term coined by Timothy Leary. A lot of people don't realise that the set part to setting, refers to yourself. It's what state you're in, your mindset, your physical health and everything. You can avoid a lot of negative effects from substances, even alcohol, if you're in the right mindset beforehand, if you've exercised, eaten properly, slept properly. I'll go through very briefly just a history, because I don't think a lot of people are very informed, maybe you are, but I'll just skim through history. I mean, drugs have been in our society for thousands of years. There's not really any getting them out of society, and as Carl Hart says in his book, I'll talk about him in a minute, but his book, Drug Use for Grown-Ups, who would want to drugless society in the first place? A society without alcohol, without caffeine, without antidepressants, without painkillers. But alcohol, opium, mescaline in the form of peyote or San Pedro cactuses, mushrooms, tobacco, coca leaves, ayahuasca have all been in our society for thousands of years. And well, caffeine, surprisingly, has only been in it for a few hundred years. But most of these drugs have only actually been criminalised and been illegal for a bit over 100 years, which started pretty much in America. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Prohibition as well, so the banning of alcohol for about a 15-year period in America. Drugs, a lot of different drugs were made illegal just before that. Weed, for example, was actually, hemp was used, so basically the material that you can get from the cannabis plant. The Declaration of Independence was actually printed on hemp paper, but the way that they harvested hemp, unfortunately, was slavery. Now, whenever slavery was abolished in 1865, basically the hemp industry plummeted. People started using paper. But then, shortly thereafter, in the early 1900s, there was a machine invented called the decorticator, which processed hemp properly. Some of you might have heard of William Randolph Hearst. He was very powerful in America at the time, owned a lot of newspaper companies and paper mills. Hemp was announced spread, and he coined cannabis, at the time marijuana. You've probably all heard that word. It originally had nothing to do with the cannabis plant. Marijuana was a slang term for a Mexican wild tobacco. People didn't even realize what they were outlawing by the time it was actually made illegal. Other propaganda was then spread, such as reefer madness, and unfounded claims were made about marijuana being smoked by blacks and Mexicans, and then claims were made about them becoming violent and raping white women. Similar claims were made about cocaine and heroin. You are probably aware cocaine used to be in Coca-Cola, and interestingly enough, coca leaves are actually still used in the production of Coca-Cola. And Coca-Cola is the only company in America that is allowed to import coca leaves for their use in their product. They just take the cocaine out of it. You can fact check this all you want. It's all available online and elsewhere, books primarily. But cocaine was originally used by dock workers in America, and there was claims that then came along that it was making specifically black men. This is a very discriminatory issue, the drugs topic, maybe a lot more than you are even aware of. There were claims that it was making black men attack and rape white women. Heroin is similar. It was coined as a Chinese drug and banned because of opium dens, which isn't the exact same drug as heroin, but it follows suit. And then the opium wars in the 1800s speak for themselves. Britain flooded China with opium, and once opposed, they had occupied Hong Kong, which wasn't given back until 1997. And also, finally, on the history of things, the cocaine powder laws, which were brought in, if memory serves me correctly, by, I think it was Reagan. And basically that meant, so the way it works, cocaine is in powder form, it's a salt. Just the technical chemistry term for it. It's a base whenever it's turned into crack, but they're the exact same drug. Crack is just a smokable form of cocaine. The cocaine powder laws meant that anyone that was caught with crack cocaine was given a sentence of in a ratio of 100 to 1 in comparison to anyone caught with powder cocaine. It's very easily converted too. Right, no problem. Now, even today, you're given a sentence of 18 to 1, and it's used in a discriminatory way because I think statistically most crack cocaine users are white, and up to 75% of the people that are charged are black. We'll just go through the difference between decriminalisation versus legalisation, just to clarify it. Decriminalisation is a bit of a misnomer. It refers to decriminalising personal use and possession of small quantities of substances. It still carries criminal charges for manufacturing and selling of certain substances. Legalisation implies regulation and taxation of psychoactive substances, similar to how alcohol is treated today. I've identified 6 primary types of drug use. Maybe some of you can add to it, but in my opinion, there's experimental use, probably one of the most dangerous types if people haven't done the research properly. Then recreational use, someone that uses regularly but not quite addiction yet. Maybe they're taking something once a month or once every few months or whatever, just slightly over the experimental phase. Then addiction, speaks for itself. Medicinal use, therapeutic use, even spiritual use, for example, peyote in Native Americans. The compare and contrast between here, how we legally treat things in other places. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about Portugal, how they decriminalised everything in 2001. Drug use rates have gone down. A lot of people don't realise, everyone talks about Portugal, a lot of people don't realise that kits similar to this, probably a bit higher tech, where they can test for specific substances and adulterants in those substances and make sure that the drugs are clean, that people are taking. They take a minute amount and they can, because that's one of the biggest problems, is contaminated substances. The media will have you believe that it's one substance in particular, and it's not. Even toxicology reports, they only ever have one, whenever normally there are multiple substances, polydrug use, and overdoses involved, and that includes alcohol. It's one of the bigger ones. You've got the Wet Nose project in Wales, basically lab testing. You can send away small samples to get them tested. Switzerland has heroin clinics, so does Belgium, the Netherlands. These I can go into more detail if you want, but they're basically for people to go into and take heroin in a safe setting. Even America has now legalized cannabis for recreational use in 18 states. Oregon has now decriminalized all use, all drug use, and there's MAPS as well, which is an organisation in America that's allowed to use substances like MDMA and psilocybin to test in therapeutic settings. It's proven to be quite effective in treating things like PTSD. So there are benefits to some of these substances that are sort of being muddied by the problem. Now I'm going to go on to the reagent test part of this. Sorry if I'm going a wee bit over. So what we're going to do here is I brought the aspirin as I was showing you. Now, taking.
You need to hold the mic.
Yeah, sure. Right. So I'll take a new one out, so you can see it come on. Right. Basically, what you would do is strip a bit of that off. I'm going to use a bit more than I need to, really, just to make sure that it works, but you would need an amount much smaller than this. These are perfectly legal. You can't actually get them in shops, which disappoints me to an extent, or chemists would probably be a better place for them, but basically, this is mandolin, a testing reagent, and what you would do is, it's yellow in colour to start with. We'll put a drop over here because I'm going to bring it around to show you the difference. So there's a drop of it there, and now I'm going to put this in here, and if that's aspirin, it'll go black, as you can see. And I'm just going to take that around and show you. Did it go again? That's test positive for being aspirin. Anyone who doesn't get to see it, be sitting there dead. One of my, thanks. So, one of the main parts to my campaign is to get something like this available for people here. You can even go a step further and get anonymous testing services, which would basically be, the way you would use these is, I've just tested that for aspirin. Now, if that was a drug that could be contaminated with God knows what, then you would test it with each of these, and they all have a different colour change, or else they don't react at all. If the colour change is wrong, or if they react in a different way, you know it's contaminated, you know there's a problem. Now, what's the point in not having these available for people that are going to take substances anyways? If anything, that is just harm reduction, and it's keeping them safe. We could go a step further, like I was saying, and have anonymous testing services where small pieces of a substance could be handed in anonymously, put in the machine, and they can do the exact chemical breakdown of what you have. It would really mitigate a lot of overdoses and keep people safe. I've used those kits to help my friends before as well, and make sure that they're safe. And sometimes it does, more often than you think, it comes up, and I say you don't want to take that. So I would advocate thoroughly for getting these available here, even getting the anonymous testing services which are available in other countries. I think there's definitely some in Portugal, like I was saying, Wales even has one that you can send it off, but it'd be better as a walk-in centre because a lot of people aren't going to plan like weeks in advance, they'll send this off and then take it or whatever. If you had somewhere that people could go, then they'd only be keeping themselves safe with this stuff. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Nicola and I'm from Lasair, Belfast. I just want to say thank you to everyone who's come here this evening to discuss this topic, as it is so important and as it was touched on before, so thank you as well. So as I said, I'm from Lasair, Belfast, and it was on the 12th of June this year in 2021 that we launched our drugs addiction and decriminalisation policy. Now, while that was launched in June, this policy was a long time in the making. It took many months of discussions internally and at meetings as well to bring this policy together and to really understand what our position is on the issue of drug addiction and drug use. So it was last year in 2020 that we first began having these discussions, and the reason why we began having these discussions was because of how prevalent drug addiction is in our communities. Whether that's in Belfast, where I'm from, or Derry here, or anywhere in the 6 counties or on this island, drug addiction is a really serious problem and it's wrecking its way through communities. Currently, as it stands, drugs are criminalised, and that means that both states on this island have policies of criminalisation when it comes to drug use. While you might think that making something illegal will make sure it doesn't happen, as I'm sure we all in this room know, that is not the case. Having drugs illegal means that it is so much harder for those who are struggling with addiction for many various reasons to come forward and access the healthcare and the support that they need. Very often as well in our society, the services which people need in order to treat their addiction and to become better, those services, if they exist at all, are often seriously underfunded, and that is if they are there at all. When we started having the discussions of having a drugs policy and what that would look like, it was very mixed at the beginning. This issue is quite an emotional issue, it's quite a sensitive topic, as I'm sure everyone is aware of. But pretending that the issue of drug addiction and drug use, pretending that it doesn't exist and it's not happening, is only making the situation so much worse. We had very long discussions about what our position as Lasair would be in relation to this issue. Our position is that we want decriminalisation of drugs to help people who are suffering from addiction. Now, as it was already explained, there is a massive difference between decriminalisation and legalisation of drugs, and I also want to briefly touch on that. Whenever the topic of drugs comes up, and there's a position put forward that isn't criminalisation, that isn't having them banned and not spoke about because it is such a sensitive topic. When you bring this up and you start to think of what could we do different, what could we do to make this situation better, often people think that this means you're in support of drug use or that you want to legalise all drugs and to complete free for all. This is absolutely not the case. And we had to have those discussions internally to, number one, so understand ourselves the difference between decriminalisation and legalisation, because before we had these discussions, I myself had absolutely no clue of the difference and what the two terms meant. But I think that just shows the importance of speaking really honestly and openly about this topic. So decriminalisation means that a person suffering from addiction who is a drug addict, they are not criminally prosecuted. There is no criminal punishment for their addiction. As it stands with criminalisation, no matter what someone's usage is, as Frankie explained, if it's recreational or experimental or it is addiction, there's no difference in terms of how that is dealt with. What we believe is that people who are struggling with addiction, which also is coupled with mental health issues, these people are treated as criminals, and they're not able to access the mental health services that they often do need, because when you're treated as a criminal and you're told that this whole topic is something that shouldn't be talked about, that drug addiction is dirty or not something, that we can be honest about, what that does, it creates this stigma that leaves people vulnerable to exploitation and abuse, because there isn't those spaces for people to be open and honest about what they're dealing with, and there also isn't services provided. So why we feel that decriminalisation is so important, the reason why we are not in favour of legalisation currently is because under the capitalist system in which we live, if legalisation was to happen, the only people who would benefit from that system are the capitalists in charge. So the state, who would bring in all of that money, all of that revenue, and would benefit economically off people's addictions. We do not think that this is the answer to the problem that we face. Decriminalisation, however, on the other hand, what that does is that it ensures it is the person who is dealing with addiction, the person who is taking the illegal substance. They are able to access services, and they are not treated as a criminal when they are honest about what they're dealing with. And this was something that was quite debated within Dhearg, and it was the discussions that we needed to have to come to this policy. So why decriminalisation? As I've already said, it ensures that the person suffering with addiction is able to access those services. And the difference as well is that under legalisation, there would be no criminal repercussion for the person supplying the drugs, the people involved in the manufacture and the distribution. We are against this because we believe that anyone who exploits their community, anyone who causes harm to vulnerable people, they should not be let off the hook. The people who we should be focusing on and working actively to try and help are the people who are suffering from addiction and need to have these spaces and to have the chance to talk about their experience. Around the world, as was already mentioned, decriminalisation is taking place. You wouldn't think that because it isn't very widely reported in the media, and Release, who are the world's oldest independent drug charity, they described the policies of decriminalisation around the world in 2016 as the quiet revolution. The emotional and physical consequences of the policy of criminalisation of drugs is visible in all our communities, whether that is death, crime, or all the sort of everything that overlaps with that, especially when it comes to the mental health repercussions of number one, addiction itself, and then number two, not being able to access the service to treat your addiction. That has a massive effect, not just on the individual themselves, but as we all know, their friends, their families, and the communities in which they live. As Republicans, we know that this can be quite a difficult conversation to have. Drug decriminalisation for us is a practical measure that we can help bring into existence that's going to have a tangible effect on people's lives. We really can't ignore this issue anymore. I know I already said it, but most people have someone in their lives, if not themselves, who deal with addiction or who deal with the mental health problems that can often lead to addiction and are associated with this issue. As long as we allow the state's policy of criminalisation to continue, we're allowing vulnerable people to be left on the sidelines of society. In 2020, the Audit Office revealed that it cost the Department of Health £1 billion a year to deal with drug and alcohol addiction services. When you think of how underfunded our mental health services are, with how underfunded our whole health service is, £1 billion could make such a massive difference. If we could only change our way of thinking, if we could change the way in which this topic of addiction is talked about and thought about, hopefully we'll be able to steer the conversation away from criminalisation and the stigma and what we have at the minute, and move towards a much more productive way of dealing with this issue. Our position, to sum it up very briefly, is that we believe the whole issue of drugs, decriminalisation and addiction, it should be treated as a health issue and not a criminal issue. The importance of decriminalisation in this area is that that is a practical way in which we can actually change to make sure that it is a health issue and that's how it is addressed. Portugal was already mentioned. In our policy, Portugal is very much used as the sort of case study, and that is because of the success that Portugal has enjoyed as the result of its decriminalisation policy. As was already mentioned, the rates of drug addiction and incidents relating to that have massively decreased ever since the policy of decriminalisation was introduced. In Portugal as well, the way in which this policy is implemented ensures that when someone who is in addiction is not caught but tries to access those services, they're met with professionally trained healthcare workers. They're met with social care workers. There's entire teams, and all the full details are in our policy, but there's a very, very practical way people are able to access help and they're not punished for their addiction. Under criminalisation, when someone who is in active addiction, when someone who is suffering from all these problems, when they are met with the state, they're met very much with criminalisation, with the legal system, and they're made to feel like a criminal instead of a vulnerable person who is in need of healthcare. We believe that as long as the capitalist system in which we're under, as long as that persists, the socio-economic conditions that lead to addiction, and also in a lot of cases make pre-existing conditions a lot worse. As long as that exists, we have to address this, and we have to do it as a health issue, because people who are struggling with addiction, they're not bad people. They're part of our communities. I've already said they're our friends and our colleagues and our families, and in the 6 counties especially, it's very hard. Not hard at all. You don't have to look very far to find someone or know of someone who is dealing with this issue right now. That is why we think having these conversations is so important. Our policy very much is the beginning of this discussion. It's hopefully the beginning of a change in our attitudes and a whole societal change, because the issue of drugs and addiction and decriminalisation as well, it's bigger than any individual. It's bigger also than any one organisation. It's something that needs to be widespread, and I feel that we can all do our part in helping move this issue along and move towards a much more productive way of dealing with addiction and drug use. If we can think of it as a health issue and we can have that empathy to help others who are struggling in this situation. Thank you.
Thanks. I would like to thank the organisers, Lasair, for inviting me here to speak and for organising it. It's great turnout. I don't have all the answers here, and we're not going to have the answers even here tonight, but it's great to see, hopefully this will turn out to be an honest, mature, comradely debate where, people of different political views and opinions can have a conversation, a mature conversation. I suppose when you look about, and you can't help notice who's not in the room, you know what I mean? It's drugs when we deal on a daily basis, we're all affected by it, or we know somebody. I know there's 3 councillors here, but political parties and mainstream political parties haven't showed up. The massive gap that I see is the community involuntary sector. There's an industry in that whole thing, drugs councillors and all of that. None of them have bothered. Right? There is any apologies, but there's a lot of people missing. having this debate, telling us that we're wrong. You know, there's probably not going to be two people in this panel who will have the same ideas. So I think it's important they mention that, and I think we have to question why are they not here, you know. But sure, we can put our own opinions on that. My sort of notes here tonight, and bear with me because I forgot my reading glasses, problems with growing older, is from a Republican document. You know, I was going to write all this stuff, and then I said another document there that blocks stuff in, written by Republicans. And it's addressed to a Republican audience, and I'm very aware that there's people in here tonight from different political persuasions who would be unionist and who would be, you know, certainly not Republican. So what I would say is, whilst my notes are aimed at Republicans, we should bear in mind that it sort of one hat fits all. What I'm saying, because drugs don't discriminate. You know, it doesn't matter if you're black, white, Protestant, Catholic, Republican, unionist, the same problems exist. So drug abuse is a social problem with criminal symptoms, as opposed to a criminal problem with social symptoms. This is an essential distinction, because to recognise drug abuse in social terms demands social strategies to address it. Republicans must therefore recognise that any policies on the issue must be multi-dimensional in order to be relevant to the problem they seek to address. Ideology, politics, law, education, health, and community action are all essential constituent parts of any policy dealing with the drugs issue. The drugs issue is not simply the sum total of its parts, a neat equation requiring equally neat solutions. Removing drugs does not remove all the effects they have had, both on individuals and in communities alike, nor indeed does removing drugs remove the motives and underlying causes which prompted or forced people to abuse them in the first place. The totality of the drugs problem is so varied and fluid that being anti-drug is an exceptionally narrow policy, despite the lure of the broad stroke assumptions. The ever-violent inclinations associated with the drugs trade amplify the militant presumption, almost to the point of such a policy being deemed inevitable. Confrontation will lead to violence. Can such violence lead to any credible long-term solutions? The endemic violence associated with the drugs trade has in itself done nothing to stem that trade, which begs the question, why should violence from any other quarter have a materially different effect? Adoption of realistic policies in the context of their abilities to pursue them to any realistic degree. For Republicans who draw the bulk of their grassroots support from the communities most affected by drug abuse, such realism is more pronounced due to the presumption that militant action is to the forefront of any Republican policy. This presumption has had the negative effect of communities failing to respond to Republican efforts to properly organise them against drug abuse, relying instead on the aforementioned presumption to take a lead. National drugs policy is first and foremost founded on party political considerations, and it is these considerations through which the various social observations are filtered. The basic policy of successive governments was to continue to deny that its approach and that of the majority of governments was ultimately futile in addressing the drugs trade. Drug abuse and the social and economic consequences which ensue from it. A key component of this denial is political immaturity and an inability to make far-reaching decisions due to constituency considerations and restrictions. Another key factor is the political disconnect from the problem itself. It is also essential to recognise that the worldwide efforts to counter illegal drug sales and abuse have in themselves evolved into an industry and form part of economic infrastructure in their respective countries. This status represents a major conflict of interest in that those charged with tackling drug trafficking and its effects are in themselves dependent on the continuance of such trafficking for its own economic survival. When a conflict is perennial, it invariably transforms into an industry. The central premise of this policy approach is to concentrate on a need for a core shift in policy outlook based on the following realities. The conventional strategies against illegal drug selling and abuse have failed. The establishment political class will not initiate fundamental change in its drugs policy. The economics of the drugs trade must be central to dealing with its effects. The trade and use of drugs are inevitable, and to such an extent that blunt prohibition is both pointless and hugely counterproductive. The common denominator between supply and demand and cause and effect is economics. The economics of drug dealing, the profit margin, is the sole reason people engage in it. Economics also determines the extent of availability, the extent of abuse, the effectiveness of the legal response, the effectiveness of medical response, the effectiveness of rehabilitation and educational response, the extent of related criminality, and the resources to tackle this criminality. Appropriate and effective measures addressing all aspects of the illegal drug trade can only come through state control over the economics of it. This required the phased control of some currently banned drugs. Just to clarify, when I talk about state, I think it's important to point out, it's not an endorsement from me of either rogue states on this part of the island. But I think that, when we talk about decriminalisation, it can't happen without state involvement. So that's where I'm coming there, just in case anybody thinks that I'm actually trying to say that, but unfortunately, the states that we have, and all of that comes with it. Controlling the economics. To place the economics of drug selling and abuse under the state control affords the state massive leverage in dealing effectively with the problems associated with it. The criminality of drug dealing and associated criminality is largely removed. The economics of the drug trade are ring-fenced to address underlying reasons for drug use and to address the legacy problems caused by them. The use of drugs is regulated. State resources from policing to healthcare are liberated and can be refocused into other areas in their field. Drug abuse is recognised as a social issue and brought into the open as a problem to which all society has a duty of care towards. Drug addiction is treated and not criminalised. To take control of the economics of the drug trade is to fundamentally alter the dynamic and direction of existing drug strategies. However, that dynamic can only be of benefit to society under socialised control. Placing the economics of the drug issue into private enterprise is to substitute one exploiting force with another. To date, community anti-drugs activities, irrespective of how they are defined or agreed with, remain simply that: an opposition without alternative vision. As an opposition alone, they have failed communities along similar trajectory that state efforts have failed also. Effective community action can only come about with viable objectives to pursue. Efforts must be synonymous with achievement, just as strategies must be synonymous with success. A change of emphasis from criminalisation to socialisation of the drug abuse problem is essential if any serious inroads are to be made in tackling it. What's essential to maintaining and progressing advances in this area is continued community involvement seeking such changes. Being a part of such changes and being accountable to such changes. Republicans need to look at this in the overall and evaluate for themselves where our own resources and outlook can be best applied to form a progressive and positive contribution to this process.
Just want to say thank you to everyone of our speakers here in the panel. I thought that was brilliant and very well informed from everyone. I'd like to open it up now for questions to the floor. I don't think our mic is going to reach everyone, but I don't think we'll have too many problems hearing each other. If I do repeat the questions for purposes of the panel and the recording here at all. So if anybody has any questions that they would like to put to anyone on the panel, feel free to stick your hand up and we'll get round you. If I could ask, when you're asking ask them in question, could you just identify exactly who it's to or if it's everyone? Thank you very much. Yes, go ahead.
I'm Paul Corbett from Lasair, Belfast. I was working with Nicola quite closely and a lot of other members in bringing this document forward, and one of the things we discussed, which Nicola touched on, was the significant costs that went through the state system to criminalise drug users and those suffering from addiction. Went into the billions when you think of all the state actors that are involved in terms of policing, prison systems, court systems, etc. And I'd just like to re-emphasise the point that if that money was redirected as part of a decriminalisation policy through the health systems, it could help rebalance, as Nicola says, the serious issues out there. But I had a question for Frankie, if you don't mind, just when we're talking about costs and stuff. I mean, are these kits, which are, I understand you're talking about for drug users testing their own what they're going to take and stuff. Why are they not readily available? Is there a cost, or is there a legal prevention, or what's?
It's a good question. So you might be wondering as well why it's able to test for aspirin. Is anyone able to tell me any ideas? I wasn't actually aware until I looked into it. Why?
Aspirin's a blood thinner, so if you take blood thinners, it means that other drugs will have a...
Something more simple than that. It's actually to make sure that the kits are still in date. Because they last, they last for, so they last for about a year. Best kept in the fridge. Will last longer, and they have about 100 uses, so about 100 wee droplets basically in it. So you only need about 10 milligrams of the substance or so to test it. Drop a drop on it, and that'll tell you. And obviously you want, like I was saying, to use more than one kit just to test for anything that could be added into it. I'm not 100% sure why they're only available online. As far as I can see, people aren't even really aware of them as a thing. It's a bit strange. I learned about them originally just off YouTube videos when I was much younger. There were videos on how to use stuff safely, and they were advocating for these. They are in use in other countries. They're actually shipped in from Sweden, I think. But they're more widely available in other places, and I think that they should really be brought in here, or like I was saying, even better, bring in the lab testing, basically anonymous testing services, which is already here when you think about it, because whenever they criminalise someone, they have to test the substance to say what it is. So it's already in use here, but it's being used for the wrong reasons.
I came this morning to commend Michelle and Lasair for promoting the policy of decriminalisation, particularly in sort of Republican areas. I think it's small overdue. You think about Republicanism and their sort of viewpoint on drugs, sort of stemming from the campaign and keep drugs out of areas. A lot of the sort of older Republicans would stall of that sort of small talk of just no name ever. I think it's up to us as younger Republicans, they change that attitude and say that we need a different approach. And decriminalisation is a basis for, you think about the, schools around sort of acceptance of policing, not because it was a unionist police force, but any police force or service in Britain or down south America or female with their current policy. But drug-related deaths in the north is increasing every year. And I suppose what I would ask yourself, Nicola, is there an option there to make a broad party-based sort of campaign around the sort of 32 countries for decriminalisation?
Thank you. Yeah, I actually just want to say first, because this was something that our wee friends, as we are, mentioned. I think there certainly is that sort of attitude and mentality that we do think, you know, it is as young Republicans that we may have this more liberal, you know, view on this issue and on the issue of addiction. And I certainly know what you mean in terms of some people are very closed off and, you know, want to stick their head in the sand and don't want to address this. But something that, you know, being quite passionate about this topic that is so great to see, it's that completely regardless of age or also as well preconceptions, you know, people who may be very, very closed off to this topic and think that decriminalisation means something it doesn't. Once you have those discussions and you have those sort of open conversations, people really do understand the importance of addressing this issue. And I think that, you know, whether it's age or gender or class, you know, or politics as well, I think this is a conversation that we need to be having with as many people in our lives as we can, because it reaches everyone in society. But just sorry then to go back to your question, something that, you know I did mention before, that this very much is the beginning, hopefully, of a much bigger conversation, and hopefully from those conversations and from everyone educating themselves and becoming more aware of this issue, we would like to think that activism would follow on from that. At the present moment, Lasair, we don't necessarily have all the resources or, you know, enough, I don't want to say anything, but all the resources to do that type of activism. But something that for me is extremely, you know, positive to think of is that we may be at the beginning now, but we don't know where this conversation may be, say next year, or in 5 years, or whenever that may be. So I would love to see those type of campaigns, similar to other campaigns that we saw around different issues, really take off, because like you said, it is a 32-country issue, and it's something that we should be working, you know, to eradicate the problem of people being criminalised for addiction in every part of this island.
Thank you, Nicola. Thank you for the question. Does anyone else have anything to say? Yeah, go ahead.
My name is Barry Brown. I'm a party leader with the Drug Law Reform Party. We're standing elections for drug law reform. First thing we're going to call for is drug laws to be devolved back to Northern Ireland. But getting back to decriminalisation, it's a good step in the right direction. Not enough, but would you agree that, for example, cannabis, under the Spanish model, cannabis can be legalised, regulated under a socialist model with no profit, with all the profits going to local communities and the groups, and more importantly, pay for all these things you're talking about at the front. Would the group agree that the cannabis industry could be structured in such a way that the money was kept locally and not going to the taxman and anywhere else? Would you agree to that for full regulation? I know you talked about that was a stumbling block to full regulation of drugs. Would the panel agree that could be done? Would that be supported?
I'd like to answer that as well, just as a member of Lasair and to part in the discussions. We were very reluctant to make a difference between cannabis and other drugs because of many reasons. And there was a reluctance to set cannabis aside and treat it as something different. One of our big concerns was when we looked at the economic model was the utilisation of any type of product for the purposes of profit. And we find that under the current system that exists, the current economic system, capitalism, the likely outcome will be profiteering and the growth of capital and big business into that industry. Well, I'm actually not entirely familiar, and we were heavily informed by the Portuguese model, but there are massive concerns there. What we could agree on as a first step was decriminalisation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the conversation is done. So.
Yeah, back around there.
So, yeah, I'm Sean, I'm a people for-profit councillor, and I want to thank the panellists. I welcome the comments and very much agree with decriminalisation. We've long campaigned for it, and not necessarily a question, but I'll put some stuff out and people can see what you think. I mean, look, the US government made a war for decades, a war on drugs as they called it. It wasn't a war on drugs, it was a war on the black community in the United States, and it led to the incarceration of millions of black young people, young men, and it was designed to break the black community. The black community that led the Civil Rights Rebellion, that was the Black Panther Party, And in a lot of ways, the US government used the war on drugs to do exactly that. They were not about eliminating drugs, and they weren't about saving and helping black people in the US. Now you can walk into a shop in Boston and you can buy any type of cannabis legally that you want, and you can find out exactly what's in it. And that's because of the campaigning for decriminalisation and legalisation that's been going. Yes, there are big businesses now moving in to make profits, but you know, it was a failed war on drugs that was really a war on the black community. Here, it's very clear that the PSNI are using the issue of drugs to seek further legitimisation in the communities. And this is happening right now at a moment when people across the world are questioning the role of the police. It's not just about a few bad apples, it's about the police as a structural organisation, an institution which is institutionally racist, institutionally sexist, institutionally homophobic, and they are trying to use this issue of drugs to come into communities to say we'll sort this out. The police are not going to solve as most people probably agree, they're not going to solve the drugs issue. They're going to use it to further their legitimisation and exploit people. So I think the panellists are absolutely right. This has to be treated as a social issue. It has to be treated as a health issue. And the first step for people is we have to be able to make sure that you know, whatever drugs that people are using, be it legalised alcohol, legalised what do you call it, prescribed drugs. There is a prescription crisis as well. It's not just illegal drugs that you can get for the doctor. And you might be in a hospital waiting list for 4 or 5 years, and you're taking the strongest drugs available to deal with it, and all of a sudden you've got an addiction, or you're trying to access cat, weed, and coke. These are all different forms of addiction. People should be treated not as criminals, but as people who need you know, help or mental health. The last thing I'll say, look, there is an urgency about this discussion, because Derry City and Gabhann councils declared, as Gary and Sean and Dave will all know, a mental health crisis. And we know what that means. Look, the combination of poverty, terrible health, the lack of opportunity, and all these things that are happening to us right now, universal credit cuts, higher taxes, right? It's going to leave a lot of people feeling desperate, and I think that will lead to more people using drugs. So it is urgent right now that we actually have a proactive strategy that's not about criminalising people, but it's actually about helping people. So we have to try and help people, I think, who are dealing with drugs, but we also have to try and fight for something that makes people feel that this is not the solution to whatever challenges that they're facing in their lives, which is a much bigger task. But I think we have to try and do multiple things all at the same time. So maybe that, if people have an opinion about that, would be very much welcome the discussion about you know, decriminalisation right across the 32 counties.
Thank you, Sean. Do you want to speak on that? Preference even first? Frankie, you some more for
a lot of good points there. I don't think I could disagree with any of them. It is a very discriminatory issue. I mean, even here, I would say it's used to discriminate against class people as well. There's a class element to it. And it is about removing the stigma too, around who people think users are as well. And they have this idea in their head that it's someone from maybe a working class background or someone just lying on the street or whatever. Like there are people from all walks of life and all backgrounds that are drug users, and could potentially become addicts. Dhearg points out in his book, one of his friends said, think about it, drug trafficking is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Per people alone can't sustain the operating budgets of drug cartels. Like, it's not just per people that are taking drugs, quite clearly from that statement. I think one of the bigger problems to people's health is definitely, bigger issues is definitely contaminated substances, as I've emphasised at every opportunity here. But also definitely dealing with implementing proper addiction services as well.
as I said earlier, I don't have all the answers, and probably what has me here is my work, probably as a community and political activist and as an elected representative. But I think it's important that we have this debate. But what I do know for certain is that what we have at the minute isn't working and that people are dying. That's the cold reality, is that there's young people going to early graves because of the situation that we have, and that should not be happening. One of the biggest problems is prescription drugs. And the biggest drug dealer, for want of a better word now, is probably the internet. People just had to click a button and it's there in 2 days, they can track it going. But Sean mentioned about the mental health crisis and that, and I think it was about 2 months ago where there was a spate of deaths of young people in the city, and it was brought up in the council, and one of the suggestions came from an hour independent councillors. Look, we need to set up a working group here. We need to get into the room. We need to have a conversation. And we was told come back next month, put it in as a motion, which did. But that straight away was and in my view, deliberately obstructed when there was an amendment put it that we need the PSNI in there, we need the Department of Justice, and we need the PCSP in there. It's a Police and Community Safety Partnership. And my argument was, but these are the people who said, these are the experts, we need them in the room. And the attitude is, if these are the experts, what's happening? It's not, it's a wild drugs, young people are dying, So numbers worked out where they put that, and now straight away that excluded a lot of people, despite a logical argument come from people who would be opposed to PC or the British policing structures, saying, look, let us get in the room. And he sees any stage down the line, you think, we should invite them in, or we should invite them. And by all means, and whoever doesn't want to be in that room can have the option of, I'll step out. It wasn't good enough. No, they need to be in right from the start. And the way I look at it is, if you're a young person and they're in trouble or there's something wrong, and it's connected to drugs or you need to talk to them, you're not going to ask the Peter to come in. Because straight away, they're going to jail, or what have you taken, or you're bringing a nurse, you're bringing a doctor, you're bringing somebody, a mental health counsellor. But just on that, back to the motion. So they got it through that they would set up a task and finishing group or a working group, and it's my understanding that it hasn't even met, that they haven't even organised it. I know maybe if any of the councillors are here could contradict me on that or keep me right. It was just stop it. And I think that feeds into some of the resistance that we see Lasair trying to get this organised, is that there's people out there who don't want to change, because if they want to change tactics or adapt, they have to admit that what we have at the minute is a complete and utter failure. And they see that as a slight on themselves. But in the meantime, young people are going to prison needlessly, and others, more unfortunately, are going in the cemetery. And it's wrong. And it's I think the conversation needs to be had, and the conversation needs to go into the solution. And if somebody out there has a solution, then by all means, let us hear it. But what we have at the minute definitely isn't working.
Just one more comment there based on that I meant to say about prescriptions. A lot of people aren't aware that one of the bigger issues with prescriptions are that there are also fake prescription pills, like Xanax and other forms of prescriptions that aren't actually coming from a manufacturer. They're coming out of labs in other countries. They're contaminated with things like fentanyl. UK, and I think cocaine's still used medically in certain places as well, but like lots of people don't even realise stuff like that. And up until now, with Lasair putting out their decriminalisation policy and other groups starting to have this talk, it was surprising to me that this is one of the few topics that Republicans align themselves with British policies on. Thank you.
Yeah, we have questions for you.
My name is Julia Keane, and I'm a unionist from the city, work predominantly within the PU health community. And I just wanted to say that this isn't a Republican issue. It is very much an issue across the board. Unfortunately, I think, what would you say, ex-combatants within the PUL community are probably still more involved in drugs and the distribution of them, and aren't as far forward as what the Republican community are, unfortunately. And it is something that isn't talked about within the community, probably because of that. And a lot of families are impacted, especially by, I would think, not so much probably, but prescription addiction is a very, very big issue in the PUL community. I just wanted to make that statement, but I really like the thought of the criminalisation to the socialisation. You know, drug addiction does not discriminate across classes either. It's not a working class issue as such. It is an issue across all classes. It's an issue across society. There needs to be community-focused solutions in order for people to engage at a localised point. So I really welcome the fact that there's young people here that are pushing for a policy that's going to help young people, and it's going to support young people around decriminalisation. I support decriminalisation as well. And I think it's really good moving forward, but I think we really need to think across the board. It's not just a Republican issue. Young people within unionist communities are absolutely dealing with the same thing. And as a manager at the minute of a Northern Ireland-wide and border region youth project, mental health and the use of drugs is massive across both of the communities. And it is definitely something that could be developed further on a cross-community basis.
Thank you very much for that. Very much appreciated. Anybody else have anything else to add before we wrap up?
Sorry, can I just say?
Yeah, go ahead, sure.
I'm from Belfast in the area, and I was interested in Portuguese and your Portuguese problem. But and I agree with the decriminalisation. But there would be a lot of people that wouldn't accept decriminalisation of drugs because of the stigma, because of their lack of understanding, because of that. I think if it was personally me moving forward on it, I would be looking at it for reframing it into a health setting, a way. So I'd be, instead of saying we want to decriminalise, look at it more from the health, moving it towards the health side. So you're looking at moving away, decriminalisation is moving away from the justice section, but look at the health side and reducing the stigma. I'll be looking at that more than we would be pushing straight away for decriminalisation, because a lot of people wouldn't accept that. And if they understand the health side and the importance of moving it into health as opposed to keeping it where it is, people will be more likely to, from all areas, would be more likely to consider it, take it on board and vote for it.
I would say, unfortunately, people are going to be forced to understand if we don't take a stance. Over the course of my lifetime, since I started taking substances whenever I was 14, I've watched things change completely. And I know that it's a bit of a strange issue here. I know just even from word of mouth talking to older people that drugs weren't really around so much like during the Troubles. I think that there were, from what I've heard, there were things like research that 95% of what was being taken into the drug testing tents and presented as MDMA or in pill form as ecstasy was MDMA or ecstasy, so it was safe enough. Post-lockdown, 50% of what is being handed in is MDMA. So 50% of it's not. So 50% of it could be a chemical that could do way more damage to you, cause God knows what problems. I think one of the biggest parts to this is, like I said at the start, having this conversation. Just, it doesn't matter if you have completely opposing views to what I'm saying, at least having the conversation, not taking action about it. Like, not taking physical action, I mean, or penalising people would help. Like, it would have a massive impact. We need to start having these conversations just within our families, within our friend circles. It's not going to hurt. And in terms of educating young people as well, I mean, young people already get things like sex education, so why couldn't they have education regarding this? Like I was saying, I started taking stuff whenever I was 14. I mean, it's only getting younger these days from what I've experienced whenever I was in A-levels. I would have been one of the younger ones that started things whenever I did, but whenever I was in A-levels, I was seeing first and second years taking drugs, like harder drugs, not even just grass. So like this problem is getting much, much worse. It's snowballing, and if we don't do something about it now, or if we don't at least have that conversation and start to plan for the future, then like we're gonna have deaths here, and people are gonna be seriously injured. Thanks.
Yes, I just wanted to reply as well because I think everything you said, it just sums up I agree with everything as well, it just sums up the importance of having these discussions and, you know, depending on the context and who you're speaking to, you know, framing in the discussion, because like Frankie said, this is only getting worse and we're already at a very, very urgent stage. Within our policy, you know, specifically, we have outlined, you know, the practical measures that could be done to help people dealing with addiction and to help this issue. And whether that's, you know, safe testing kits or that's having a safe needle exchange within a medical centre, you know, there is a long list of the different medical practices within the healthcare system that could be done to help people dealing with addiction. And that is all, you know, healthcare related, that is all coming from that angle. I think, you know, as you said, the problem is in people's mentalities. It's in the stigma associated not just with decriminalisation, but with drugs and addiction itself. And I think one of the hardest parts of this discussion is finally taking steps to try and remove that stigma. You know, whether it's being really open and honest and saying we need policy change, we need criminalisation to end because it's not working. We need decriminalisation. You know, that sounds really harsh, but I think of it this way, decriminalisation is the vehicle that's going to get us to those healthcare-based solutions, and that's something I like to see. So I think it's just so important that we are having those discussions and we are being honest about the terminology and what actually can be done to help create solutions.
Yeah, one more question, just to back it up.
Just a really quick point, just from a healthcare point of view. I'm also a for-profit councillor, but I also work in a health service. And, you know, as we know at the moment, the health service is under severe pressures and crisis and needs, you know, massive transformation. But I think, you know, that is an opportunity for us to really, you know, fight for better care for people with addiction and people, you know, who have misused substances, to be fighting that fight as we fight for the health and social care service as well, because it's a health and social care service, and it's those two pillars that are going to address the drug crisis here as health and social approaches. And I think that like decriminalisation is essential, and there is a drug strategy, as far as I'm aware, coming out this year, and there has been strong voices trying to push for decriminalisation within that strategy. I'm not sure that it's going to
expecting the attendance that we got, and so thank you from everybody from all walks of life and beliefs for coming. It's really encouraging to see. I want to thank the speakers. I want to thank Frankie, Nicola and Gabhann for coming, giving their views and adding to the night's event. I want to thank a personal thank you to Healy, who really helped me get, not me but Lasair, helped this happen tonight. And without her this would not have probably went ahead. And if anybody else wants to find out more about Lasair, please don't hesitate to get in touch, either via ourselves or via social media. And thank you again to absolutely everybody for attending tonight's event. Cheers.